Hello, everybody. Once again, I am Lee McCrafton Jr., aka Zorvalchan Less Than Guru, and today I want to talk about movement within melees, especially when you combine them with actions and some of the things that you might want to consider as you're deciding how to run your Palladium game. And this can be any Palladium game, not just Palladium First Edition. This has brought up some discussion within the Palladium community as a whole. So, in various books, the way that combat works is explained a little bit differently, and that's why you will have variations at your tables, especially between people playing the different Palladium games, because the Megaversal system isn't necessarily a universal system. There are specific rules that are only in specific game lines, but a lot of people use them anywhere. Like changing OCCs is a specific Palladium fantasy. It's in their first edition, it's in their second edition, but it's not talked about in other books. But some people bring it in because it's easy to bring in. So certain things like that happen. And this is one of those things that happens with combat. So every character in Palladium, if they advance far enough, will probably end up with multiple attacks per melee. And Palladium, well, they use the term melee rounds or melee, not just a combat hand to hand or close counter combat. Their specific term is melee for a melee round. So that's why you will get something like 5 attacks per melee means 5 attacks per round. So just to clarify that, if you're only thinking about playing Palladium and you don't know the terminology. So there are various ways to do things. And the very first method that I used, even in Robotech and Palladium First Edition, is I did it very similar to how a lot of games such as D&D in the past and Pathfinder and later editions of D&D currently do it. Is everybody rolls for initiative. Well, in back D&D that wasn't always true, but when it got to your turn, you would do all your attacks. So if you had 5 attacks per melee, you do all 5 attacks when it's your turn. If you have 2 spell attacks, you could do 2 spell attacks on your turn. Once you're done, it moves to the next person. So that works fine. And if you look at my last episode on movement, it will fit in very well with how I structure the movement in combat, being not as far as just the flat out running as fast as you can. And I explain that, and I won't in the last episode I won't explain that again. But that way would work really well, and it would allow you to easily convert any Pathfinder or D&D of any age adventures. When you have scales, it works well with that. And I have used that on my virtual tabletops and in my battle maps on a table very well without problem. Okay, so here's the thing, is the way that most Palladium games describe how attacks work is everybody rolls for initiative, and then everybody who has an attack does their first attack. And then anybody who has 2 attacks does their second attack in order. And as someone runs out of attacks, then they stop, and it just keeps going with those who still have attacks left. So at some point, you will have a flurry of blows at the end, and that's described in a few of the Palladium games when they explain how combat works. Is you will have a flurry of blows. And in Palladium, if you do not have automatic defenses of automatic dodge, automatic parries, things like that, then each parry, dodge, roll with a punch, etc. will reduce your attacks by 1. And then you, as a game master or as a table, are going to have to decide, do you allow attacks from future rounds to be reduced? And that's how it's stated in the books, or most of the books that I've seen. It implies that you can take your actions in future rounds, but then when those future rounds come, you either have a reduced number of actions, or you may not even have any actions for 2, 3, 5, an infinite amount of rounds in the future. because you've already defended. And then all you're doing at that time is completely defending. So you're not completely out of the game because you can keep reducing those future round attacks per melee. I personally, this is how many actions, attacks you have in this round. And when you run out, you can't defend anymore. There's no taking a future. And that's how I kind of allow it, so that in the next round, that person might then roll really high and get an attack off. But you'll have to decide that. But in either of these cases, you'll have to determine how movement works, because movement isn't by your actions, it's by your entire round, how far you can move in a melee round. So then you'll have to decide, do I allow it just whenever? Do I allow it on the first, before the first attack, or split it up? And if you split it up, the knee-jerk reaction and kind of the first thing that pops into your mind is, oh, it's simple. You take your movement and you divide it by your number of attacks. But then what happens is those who have more attacks, if they have an equal amount of movement for the round, those with more attacks per attack will move less. So I'm not going to use the Palladium numbers because, as I talked about previously, it is your speed attribute times 20 yards. And when you're using feet, that would be 60 feet. So let's just talk about increments. So if you have a speed, let's just say of 10, let's say that you have 10 increments. So we have two characters, they each have a speed of 10. So they each can go 10 increments. And one of them only has one attack. So in their turn, they can move 10 increments, they can attack, or they can attack and then move 10, or maybe you'll let them move 5, attack, and then move 5 increments after that. And that's all fine. But the person who has 2 attacks, now their first one, they're only allowed to move 5, half. And the second, they're allowed to move 5. What if they don't move? Will you let them combine them at the end or at the beginning and not move later on? Or do you just say no, you each time, and if you don't use it, you lose it? And then imagine in Palladium, especially the newer games, or the post Palladium first edition, if we talk about 80s being the newer games, the late 80s being newer games, many times the base is 3 to 4 attacks, because Palladium in certain games has what's known as the 2 attacks for living, which means if you don't have any hand-to-hand combat skills, you still get 2 attacks just for being alive. And then you start adding to that, and it's very easy to start off with 4 to 5 as a base attack as soon as you get a combat skill. So if you have that increment of 10 and you have a person that has 5, they're only going to move 2 increments per action that they have, whereas the 2 attacks for living person is going to move 5 increments per action. So it's going to be very strange any way you cut it. The way that I do it, I'm not going to say is the best way. It's just the way that I found out that I could do, not worry about. And I understand it has its shortcomings, but it's not something that I have other things that I want to put time and energy into thinking about, other things that are in this video series as well as my Toward Eternity things. But I just say, hey guys, within the round, move up to your movement. I don't care if it's all at the beginning, all at the end, you scatter it out. But if you get to a point where you run out of movement and you're a melee person and you don't have a bow or you don't have ranged spells or something to throw, then you won't be able to attack. And I do that with the enemies as well. And if you watch my Palladium playthroughs on this channel in my campaign number 1, the Palladium Nintir Veil, you will see that happening with monsters a lot, where they will be running through a dungeon environment and they just stop, and then they might have 3 attacks, 4 attacks, 5 attacks that they can't use because they're not within melee combat and they just have claws and bites. That is something that works equally for both the player characters and the opponents that they go against, so it's kind of a wash in my mind. But if you don't like that, you will need to determine a way And maybe you do decide that having that person who has multiple attacks moving in shorter increments fits your style. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that I personally think it's kind of weird and I would just rather allow people to move. But for people who've never played Palladium and have come in and seen how it works, they've questioned why things happen that way. And it's basically how Palladium sets up their melee number of attacks is divorced from their movement, and you have to figure out how it gets combined. So, having said that, once again, I'm Lee McCrafton Jr., aka Zorwatch on Less Than Guru, and until next time, I will catch you later.